At 11:17 on a Thursday morning that began like any other, Prince William's phone rang with a tone reserved for only the most urgent palace communications, the kind of call that arrives maybe twice in a lifetime, the kind that divides time into before and after. Within seconds of answering, his face drained of color. His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble. And in that moment, standing alone in his private office at Kensington Palace, while winter lights streamed through windows that suddenly felt too bright, William received news so devastating that even the stone walls seemed to absorb the shock. The shattering moment. The call came from Sir Clive Alderton, King Charles's principal private secretary, a man known for his unshakable composure even during the monarchy's darkest hours. But today, his voice carried something William had never heard before. Not quite panic, but close, something urgent and irreversible. "Sir," he began, the formal address feeling heavier than usual, "you need to return to Windsor immediately. There's been a development, a serious one." William didn't waste time asking questions. The tone told him everything he needed to know. Whatever had happened was beyond routine crisis management, beyond the typical turbulence that defined royal life. He ended the call, stood motionless for 3 full seconds, then moved with the kind of focused urgency that comes from years of training for moments you pray will never arrive. Catherine was in the nursery when he found her. She looked up from helping Charlotte with schoolwork, and the expression on William's face stopped her mid-sentence. She knew that look. She had seen it only once before when his grandmother died. Without a word, she stood, excused herself from the children, and followed him into the hallway. "It's bad," William said quietly, his voice barely steady. "They won't say what over the phone, but it's bad enough that they're locking down communications." Catherine's hand found his arm, squeezing gently. She didn't ask questions either. Some moments require silence, not interrogation. Within minutes, William's protection officers had been briefed. A car was already waiting in the courtyard, engine running, ready to make the 20-minute drive to Windsor in half that time. Staff moved through Kensington Palace with practiced efficiency. But even they sensed something different in the air today. The housekeeper, who had served the Wales family for 15 years, later told colleagues she felt a chill that had nothing to do with December weather. As William's car pulled away from Kensington Palace, traveling at speeds normally reserved for genuine emergencies, Palace communications teams across London were receiving encrypted messages, lockdown protocols activated. All non-essential media briefings postponed indefinitely. Senior household staff recalled from leave. The machinery of crisis management, dormant for months, roared back to life with terrifying speed. At Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was even more tense. Staff who had arrived for routine duties found themselves redirected, corridors cleared, private rooms sealed. Princess Anne had arrived 30 minutes earlier, her face set in the expression she wore during the most difficult moments. Queen Camilla remained inside the private apartments, and those who glimpsed her through doorways reported she looked as though she had aged a decade overnight. But the most telling sign of catastrophe came from the absence of information. No official statement, no carefully worded health update, no reassuring press release, just silence, heavy and ominous, settling over the monarchy like snow before a storm. And in that silence, one truth became unmistakable. Whatever news was racing toward him, it would change everything. The hours before the morning had begun, ordinarily enough, somehow made what followed even more surreal, even more impossible to reconcile with the catastrophe that would arrive by midday. William had woken at 6:30, his usual time, to the sound of his alarm and the faint voices of his children already stirring in their rooms down the hall. He'd shared breakfast with Catherine and the children in the warm kitchen at Kensington Palace, discussing George's upcoming exams and Charlotte's piano recital. The mundane details of family life that provided anchor and normalcy amid the extraordinary weight of royal duty. Lizzie had spilled juice on the table, Charlotte had complained about her mathematics homework, and George had asked, as he did most mornings, whether he could skip his French lesson. Ordinary, beautifully, heartbreakingly ordinary. By 8:15, William was in his office reviewing the day's schedule with his private secretary, a veterans' charity meeting at 10 o'clock, lunch with advisors to discuss the spring tour of Australia, finalize logistics, review security protocols, afternoon calls with constitutional experts regarding parliamentary procedure and some arcane matter involving the Privy Council. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the day would become one he would never forget, one that would divide his life into clear before and after. His private secretary had even joked about the light workload, suggesting with a smile that they might finish early enough for William to watch George's football practice at 4. William had laughed, grateful for the prospect of normalcy, of being simply a father cheering from the sidelines rather than a prince managing impossible expectations. But around 9:30, the first unusual signal arrived. Small but unmistakable to anyone who understood the careful rhythms of royal communication. A text message from Anne, brief and cryptic in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. "Have you spoken with father this morning?" William frowned, staring at the screen. And rarely texted, preferring phone calls or face-to-face conversations where tone and context couldn't be misinterpreted, and the phrasing felt odd, careful, as if she were testing whether he knew something she couldn't directly say. Some information she needed to confirm, he either possessed or lacked. He replied that he hadn't spoken to Charles since their brief conversation the previous evening, when his father had seemed tired but otherwise fine. Anne's response was even more concerning, arriving almost immediately. "Call me when you can privately." William tried reaching her immediately, pressing her contact with fingers that had already begun to feel cold despite the warmth of his office. The call went to voicemail. He tried again 10 minutes later, then 15 minutes after that. Same result, her voice politely asking him to leave a message, a recording that felt increasingly inadequate as his concern deepened. That's when the unease began settling in his chest, a tightness he couldn't quite explain or dismiss, a feeling he'd learned over the years never to ignore. And always answered, always. Her phone was an extension of her duty, and duty for Anne was sacred and absolute, something she would never compromise without extraordinary reason. Catherine noticed the shift in his demeanor around 10 o'clock. The way his attention had turned inward, his focus narrowing to something she couldn't see but clearly felt. "Everything all right?" she asked, pausing in the doorway of his office, her voice carrying that particular note of concern she reserved for moments when she sensed something wrong beneath the surface. William looked up from his phone where he'd been staring at Anne's unanswered calls, the screen now dark but still demanding his attention. "Probably," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise, betraying the lie even as he spoke it. "Just can't reach Anne. It's strange." Catherine knew better than to dismiss his instincts. After years together, after watching him navigate countless crises and complications, she had learned that William's sense of when something was wrong rarely failed him. By 10:30, more pieces of the puzzle emerged, though none of them made sense yet. None of them formed a coherent picture he could understand. William's equerry mentioned in passing that the king's morning schedule had been suddenly cleared, all appointments cancelled without explanation, or the usual diplomatic restructuring that accompanied routine changes. The official line was routine adjustment, but staff who had been preparing for a scheduled investiture ceremony, laying out medals and printing programs, found themselves dismissed with barely an hour's notice. Then came word that Camilla had cancelled her public engagement at a London hospital, citing a personal matter. That detail hit harder than the others. Camilla never cancelled. Never. She prided herself on reliability, on showing up, regardless of circumstance, on maintaining the steady presence the public expected. William tried calling his father directly, dialing the private number that bypassed all normal palace protocols. The line rang 3 times before connecting, but instead of Charles's voice, he heard the apologetic tone of his father's private secretary, who explained that His Majesty was in meetings and would return the call shortly. But something in the secretary's voice felt rehearsed, scripted, as if he were following instructions to deflect rather than inform, to maintain a fiction that was already crumbling. William ended the call feeling more unsettled than before, his unease now solidifying into something closer to dread. At 11 o'clock, William was supposed to be at his veterans meeting, shaking hands and hearing stories from men and women who had served. Instead, he sat at his desk staring at his phone, waiting for clarity that refused to come, for someone to call and explain that everything was fine, that he'd been worrying over nothing. Catherine brought him tea, setting it down gently beside the papers he'd stopped reading 20 minutes earlier. "William," she said softly, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it." He nodded, but the reassurance felt hollow, inadequate. Some things couldn't simply be handled. Some things could only be endured. Then, at 11:17 his phone rang with that distinctive tone, the one reserved for only the most urgent palace communications, the one that meant someone at the highest level of palace operations needed to reach him immediately, the one that bypassed all normal protocols and announced before a single word was spoken that something had gone catastrophically wrong. William picked up on the first ring in Sir Clive Alderton's voice, strained and urgent in ways William had never heard before, delivered words that would replay in William's mind for years to come, words that would mark the exact moment his life changed forever. "The truth emerges." The drive to Windsor felt endless despite the speed, despite the fact that William's protection officer was pushing well beyond normal limits, treating empty motorway lanes as if they existed solely for this emergency. William sat in the back seat, silent, rigid, staring through tinted windows at countryside that blurred past in streaks of winter brown and gray. His protection officer, a man named Thomas, who had served him for 8 years and seen him through countless difficult moments, from family crises to security threats, knew better than to attempt conversation. Some silences demand respect, and this one felt almost sacred in its heaviness. When the car finally pulled through Windsor's gates, William noticed immediately how different everything felt, how the familiar landscape of the castle grounds had transformed into something foreign and ominous. Staff stood in unusual positions, clustered in doorways rather than moving through their normal routines. Security had been doubled, perhaps tripled, with additional officers stationed at every entrance. And the main entrance, typically bustling with the routine activity of a working palace, was sealed except for essential personnel, cordoned off as if preparing for siege rather than governance. He was directed not to the main reception rooms where official business normally occurred, but to a private wing, one used only for the most sensitive family matters, for conversations that couldn't risk even the slightest chance of being overheard. And was waiting in the corridor outside the king's private study, standing perfectly still in a way that somehow communicated more tension than any pacing could have. She stood with her arms crossed, her face grave, but composed in that way she had mastered over decades of navigating royal crisis, of being the steady hand when everyone else faltered. When she saw William approaching, something in her expression shifted subtly, not quite sympathy but acknowledgement. She knew what he was about to learn, and she knew it would hurt in ways that would reshape him. How bad? William asked, his voice low, almost afraid of the answer, but needing it nonetheless, and she didn't soften it. She never did. Worse than we thought possible. Inside the study, Charles sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, though no fire burned despite the December chill that had settled into the room's corners.